Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for part 3 of our story tonight. If you haven't heard part 1 and part 2, don't forget to click on the description because you don't want to miss out on the story. So let's continue, but before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and by all means share these stories with anyone who enjoys a good story. So let's continue with part 3 of our story. She was sure that Claudia had hoped she would be the kind of mother-in-law who fawned all over her, begging her to be best friends, shopping together and going to the spa. But that was never going to happen. Elspeth was happy if Claudia made Graham happy, and that they loved each other. After all, at the end of the day, wasn't that all that mattered? In Elspeth's experience, most parents wanted their children to be happy, but she wanted so much more for her children. She wanted them to be humble, contributing members of society, strong in the face of adversity, grateful in the face of misfortune, optimistic when life got you down. Elspeth had always wanted hardship for her kids, real, honest hardship, challenges that would make them empathetic and wise. Elspeth had seen it enough in her line of work, with people who had been through unimaginable hardships, working very hard to support their families, and these people showed such gratitude and such courage. What more could Elspeth ever want for her kids? She had seen the way Claudia had looked at her. She knew what her future daughter-in-law considered her to be, cold and aloof, and maybe she was, but she cared passionately about her children, despite what anybody else might actually think. Elspeth arrives at the bridal shop a little late, receiving a few withered glances from Rhonda, the shop assistant, who runs the bridal shop, and her daughter Simone, who's rolling her eyes at the back of her head, and muttering under her breath, "So typical of Mum to be late." Elspeth sits down on a grand, over-the-top red and gold Louis XV upholstered armchair, angled towards the red velvety curtain. She is uncomfortably pretzeled between Claudia's father, who looks appropriately misty-eyed about the prospect of Claudia's forthcoming wedding, and her daughter Simone on the other side, who is sitting up rather stiffly. "Are Mum and Dad ready?" asked Rhonda obsequiously. "Brace yourselves, ladies and gentlemen, because your girl looks drop-dead gorgeous," she says, frog-marching Claudia onto a stage and pulling back the red velvet curtains to create maximum impact. Rhonda gets down on her hands and knees like a designer, adjusting the collection of dresses that Claudia is trying on. To an appreciative audience, they're all very much alike, strapless and full-skirted, like one of those Barbies thrust into a girl's birthday cake. Elspeth draws in a deep breath. She's finding this bridal modelling show more than a little agonizing, but is trying to appear interested. She feels a tad annoyed that Rhonda, the shop assistant, keeps referring to her and Claudia's father as Mum and Dad. Elspeth had pointed out that she is not Claudia's mother, nor is she Rhonda's mother, but Rhonda seems to appear to be hard of hearing when it suits her. Elspeth has been surprised to be invited to these viewings, but she had cordially accepted the invitation from Claudia. I mean, what else could she do? "I'd really appreciate it if you'd come," Claudia had asked her bashfully. "It would mean a lot to me." Elspeth had found it hard to refuse such an eager, earnest request, even though she felt the whole affair was monstrously overindulgent. When Elspeth had got married, her mother had made her own wedding dress for her. In her opinion, the bridal shop is extravagantly over the top, but she wisely bites her lip and feigns an interest, as Claudia models one dress after another. Finally, when Claudia comes onto the stage, twirling around in a dress that she so obviously loves, she turns around to her father and says, "Dad, do you like it?" Her father stands up with misty eyes. "I love it, sweetheart. You look absolutely beautiful. Oh, my word, you really look magnificent," he says, pulling out a handkerchief from his tweed jacket and dabbing his eyes appropriately. "And you, Elspeth? What do you think?" asked Claudia, looking at Elspeth. Elspeth clears her throat awkwardly and says, "I think you look fine, quite fine, she repeats, privately thinking that Claudia looks forgettable, like a classic generic bride. Mum, says Simone, turning around to look at her mother in horror. Fine! How can you say Claudia looks fine? She looks absolutely drop-dead gorgeous. She looks incredible. That dress is absolutely amazing. Good, said Rhonda, smiling broadly. I think we can take it that Mum and Dad approve. I'll have you know, she says, turning to Simone. Fine is high praise indeed, isn't it, Mum? She says, regarding Elspeth through cat-like eyes, as if daring her to say anything prejudicial against the dress that Claudia has clearly selected. Claudia strokes the dress lovingly, her eyes shining like rhinestone jewels, her skin flushing a bright pink. I love this dress, Dad, says Claudia, swirling around and around in the bridal shop. I love it. Well, then we must have it, must we not? Cinderella must go to the ball, says her father, smiling adoringly at his daughter and glancing towards the shop assistant. What is the damage, Rhonda? He asks, clearing his throat. Rhonda goes to her computer and taps away for a very long time, as if providing a price at a bridal store is hellishly complicated. It would seem that Claudia's prudent father is resolutely determined to foot the bill for the wedding, even though Elspeth had insisted on paying half. But Claudia's father is a staunch traditionalist, even though he only earns a modest income. Rhonda whispers an amount for the wedding dress, enough for a down payment on a house, and Claudia's father tries desperately not to look taken aback. He looks like a man who's been slapped across the face with a baseball bat, and is trying to find his bearings and to orientate himself. The colour drains from his face, and he goes an ashen colour. Claudia hurriedly steps forward and says to Rhonda, her face visibly downcast, Are you sure the dress is that expensive? It's an awful lot. I'm sorry, but it is that price, I'm afraid, said Rhonda unabashedly. You see, we use real Schwarzkopf crystals in the dress. We don't skimp on all the details. That kind of thing is very important to us. It's like a ball gown, so it encompasses the use of a great deal of material, like Princess Diana's dress. Here, you know, at Princess Brides, we don't skimp on cost. We know that every bride deserves to be a princess on her big day. I'm sorry, Rhonda, but I need to try on something a lot cheaper, says Claudia resolutely. There is no way my dad can possibly pay a price like this for a wedding dress. It's ridiculously expensive. Rhonda appears to be pouting like a spoiled child. She raises a brow. But this is your special day. Isn't that right, Mum and Dad? A bride deserves to be pampered with no expense spared on her special day. I have a fabulous veil you can wear with that dress. She says, her eyes pinned on Claudia's father, who looks as if he's been backed into a corner. Claudia's father looks at his daughter lovingly and pulls out his wallet from his jacket. Is this the dress you want? He asks his daughter. Dad, no, I can't, says Claudia. I can't. It's a lot of money. Are you sure, Dad? Rhonda circles like a voucher, presenting the veil, a brisk afterthought that cannot possibly be overlooked. You need to take the veil with the dress. It's very important, she insists, tapping away at her computer friskily and throwing out another insane price that threatens to bring on a coronary arrest to poor Claudia's father, who looks like he might just faint. Of course we must take the veil as well, he agrees. Good, I'm pleased, because this is the last one we have in stock at the moment. The next shipment will be twice the price. You've got yourself quite the bargain here, because every bride has got to have a perfect wedding. Am I not right, Mum and Dad? She says, looking at Elspeth, who is recoiling in disgust. Elspeth steps forward and does not hold back. Frankly, I don't think anyone outside the ludicrously wealthy Rhonda would consider this a small price to pay for a wedding dress. And as for the veil, it is daylight robbery. That is what it is. Frankly, I'm disgusted and appalled. How can you sleep at night, girl, charging people this insane amount of money? I think it is absolutely disgusting. Everybody goes quiet in the bridal shop, as all eyes are pinned on Elspeth's remarks, while Rhonda's face has grown as red as a field of poppies. I'm afraid, Rhonda, you can forget about this transaction. My daughter-in-law does not need this wedding dress, said Elspeth fiercely, and with that she frog-marched everyone out of the store, looking more than a little confounded. But Elspeth can see relief all over Claudia's father's face. It was only in the years after this event that Claudia was privately able to conclude that Elspeth had been absolutely right about that wedding dress and its steep price that had been ludicrously over the top. In the end, she'd worn a dress that she'd found at a department store that was so simple but absolutely beautiful, and she had never regretted that decision. Indeed, the simple dress, even Elspeth had admitted to her, was far more spectacular than the wedding dress she'd tried on in the bridal store. It's so much more individual, and so you, Elspeth had said. It rarely becomes you, Claudia. And for Elspeth to give anyone a compliment was a first. I'm glad you're marrying my son, Claudia. I realise that you've got a lot of grit, and I like that about you, she said. Claudia's head had swollen with pride, and she realised in that moment she did, after all, like her idiosyncratic mother-in-law. Present-day Claudia. It had been a few days since Claudia and her husband had been visited at their home in Washington State by 2 police officers, and had been braced with the devastating news that Elspeth was now deceased, and she and her husband Graham and her 2 children were devastated to hear the fortuitous news. Elspeth was Claudia's mother-in-law, and her husband Graham's beloved mother. Claudia was surprised how attached she had grown to Elspeth over the last 10 years. The woman had proved to be indispensable when it came to helping her with her children. She had been a fabulous grandmother to them. At first she had thought Elspeth was as cold as a brass farthing, with the heart of a stuffed animal, but now she knew very differently. When the police had told the family that Elspeth had committed suicide in a small living room, as a bottle of tablets were lying next to her body, it had made no sense at all to the Hancocks, because they knew that Elspeth would never have taken her life. She and Graham had been confounded, staring at the officers in bewilderment with open mouths. Claudia did not believe for a second that Elspeth would do something like this. Something smelt off, even though the police claimed to have found a suicide note written by Elspeth in a kitchen drawer saying, "Sorry, but I couldn't go on. Please forgive me." "There has to be some mistake," Graham had told the officers. "There must be. You have to know my mother Elspeth to know that something is seriously wrong here. My mother would never take her own life willingly. She was a tough old bird, she was. Nothing ever got her down." "It's true, officers," I had told them. "There is no way Elspeth would take her life like this. It makes no sense at all. The woman was passionate about her charity work. She lived to help people down on their luck. She'd never deprive them of her help by ending her life like this. She would consider such actions incredibly selfish." The officers had glanced at each other in surprise. They hadn't expected this kind of reaction from Claudia and her husband. "At this stage of our investigation, we are treating Elspeth's fortuitous death as a suicide. But we are still awaiting for an autopsy report from the medical examiner to affirm our findings." Claudia had received a phone call from Simone, her sister-in-law, that had been also very bizarre. Over the last 10 years, Simone had become her very best friend. "My mother was in a dark place," she told Claudia. "She mentioned she didn't want to go on living any more because she was devastated about Dad's passing." "But I don't understand, Simone," Claudia had said. "Your father died 5 years ago, for goodness sake. And now, after all this time, Elspeth suddenly decides to take her life. I'm sorry, but it doesn't make any sense, Simone. When did she say this to you? She never gave me the impression she was depressed. Simone suddenly sounded evasive. Well, I went to see her, didn't I, the other day? She spoke about how sad she was feeling. But I'd rather not talk about it, said Simone, suddenly going very cagey. But of course you don't want to talk about it, said Claudia. This must be very upsetting for you, Simone. I am so sorry about your mother's death. Days later, Claudia and her husband Graham had been whisked to the police station. They were being ferried into different rooms in the station. She could see her sister-in-law Simone and that odious creep of her husband Oliver being frog-marched into separate interview rooms. Simone's face looked as white as a lily, and Oliver's face was red with indignation. Oliver was leering at an officer defiantly. "What is all this about?" he protested indignantly. "Why are you separating us like this? I thought we were here to discuss my mother-in-law's autopsy report. But nothing about this interview looks benign to me. What the hell is going on here? You're treating us like criminals, and we've done nothing wrong." Simone was trying to quieten her husband down, but he never listened to his wife, but appeared to be glowering at the officers like a rabid dog that would happily tear them apart, limb from limb, if given the chance. "We did not lie to you, sir. We are not misleading you. We are indeed going to tell you about the autopsy report from the medical examiner," said an officer. "I'm afraid we have to follow police protocol. This is how we do things at the station. There are rules that need to be followed, I'm afraid." Oliver's jowls were jiggling with indignation. In recent years, Oliver had got significantly bigger, and his face resembled a hippopotamus. "I don't care whether this is police protocol or not," he snapped. "Should I be calling my lawyer? I draw the line at being treated like a suspect. This is a goddamn joke. You hear that? A goddamn joke. And I'm not here to be bullied by you men." Claudia perceived that Oliver was speaking sense. Why had they been whisked to the police station at once? One of the officers led her into an interview room. She suddenly felt very self-conscious, as if she was a criminal. Her heart pounded violently in her chest. Her fingers became all clammy and wet. She hesitantly sat on a hard, uncomfortable vinyl chair in the cold, nondescript police interrogation room, which certainly had about as much character as a blank sheet of cream paper. She found herself feeling decidedly nervous. She had seen these rooms before in movies, when people were being harshly interrogated. It occurred to her that she was a suspect. There was no way she had just been randomly drawn into this interrogation room just by chance. Then it hit her like an ice pick across the head. They hadn't been called to the station just to discuss an autopsy report. That was a crafty ruse to draw the close members of Elspeth's family to the station, like a truck of steers on their way to the slaughtering house, obliviously unaware of their impending fate. The police had brought them to the station nonchalantly, so that they would be unguarded, and then they would be separated on purpose to see if their testimonies aligned. This was a murder inquiry, and close family were like leading suspects, especially with a mother-in-law as wealthy as Elspeth. Claudia realized her mother-in-law must have been murdered, or even if she was not, the police were investigating this avenue of inquiry. She stared up at the camera in the corner of the room, tempted to wave at it. She was sure the police were watching her in another room, looking for any signs of duplicitous body language from her. She had known all along that Elspeth would never have committed suicide. It had made no sense at all. Of course Elspeth had been devastated when her husband Theo had died 5 years prior from a brain aneurysm. But Elspeth, although broken up, had picked up the pieces of her life and continued with things quite stoically. That was who she was, resourceful, brave, courageous. Claudia wondered why it had not occurred to her that her mother-in-law's death might have been more menacious, and that someone wanted her dead. But who? All these meddlesome thoughts whirled around her head like the clothes in a washing dryer. The police inspector finally entered the room, and gave her a brief cursory smile that did not appear to meet his eyes. He seemed brisk and businesslike in his manner, as if being friendly was an afterthought.
"Hello, Mrs. Hancock. I'm Detective Hunter Parkinson, and for the record, I'm taping and recording this interview. Before we start, would you like anything to drink? A coffee? A cold drink, perhaps?"
"No, I'm absolutely fine," said Claudia. "I want to know what this is about, Detective. What the hell is going on here? This isn't anything to do with an autopsy result. This is a murder inquiry, is it not? I'm not stupid, Detective. I can smell a rat. And for the record, I know for a fact that Elspeth would never, ever have committed suicide, so I suspect you're going to tell me she was murdered, and that I'm a suspect in your inquiries because I'm married to her son. It's no secret, Detective, that Elspeth was an incredibly wealthy woman. I imagine with her sizable inheritance that she's left her 2 kids very well provided for. So we're all suspects, all of us who are family members, because we have something to gain from her death. I've read enough detective novels, Detective, to know exactly how it works." The officer raised a silvery brow, and his blue eyes studied Claudia closely.
"You're a shrewd woman, Mrs. Hancock. I'll give you that. I am impressed. You're a very forthright person, and feisty too. You seem very sure of this fact that your mother-in-law did not kill herself. You do know that there was a suicide letter found in her kitchen drawer. I'm sure you were informed of this."
"Isn't that weird, officer? A suicide letter in a kitchen drawer? I mean, if I were to commit suicide, I'd leave the letter in close range of my body so everybody could see it. Not bury it away clandestinely in a kitchen drawer. That is very odd, if you ask me."
"You took the words out of my mouth, Mrs. Hancock. It is very weird indeed. Furthermore, I hasten to tell you, the handwriting on the suicide note did not match your mother-in-law's very distinctive curly writing. Someone made a lousy attempt to copy her handwriting. But our handwriting expert says somebody else wrote that note, and not very well either. It was not your mother-in-law who wrote it. But whoever wrote the note left behind no fingerprints on the paper."
"So she didn't write the suicide note," Claudia gasped. "So someone wanted her dead. They wanted to make it look like a suicide."
"I'm afraid so," said the detective. "Do you know who would want your mother-in-law dead? I want you to be very honest with me, Mrs. Hancock. It won't do you any good to try and protect someone in your family, even if you are closely related to them. It's always best to be completely honest."
"Of course, Detective. I'd never protect someone if they were responsible for Elspeth's murder."
"Oh, but you would, Mrs. Hancock. I have a son myself, you know. If I suspected he'd killed someone, I'd try to protect him in any way I could. I'd fight his corner for him. It's human nature. But it's not right."
"So from what you're saying, Detective, you've established my mother-in-law was murdered. What was the cause of her death? I was told that pills were found in her body. I thought they said she'd overdosed on something. Are you saying someone forced her to swallow those pills at gunpoint? Is that what you're saying?"
"Before I answer your questions, Mrs. Hancock, I'd like you to answer some questions of your own. Can you tell me if anything looks suspicious in this photograph that I'm going to show you?"
Claudia grimaced as the detective placed a photograph on the table. He turned it around to face her. She was certain she was going to see a picture of Elspeth's deceased body lying across the living room floor. Instead, she finds herself staring at a picture of the tiny living room, a small extension of the kitchen that Elspeth uses a lot in her home when entertaining her guests. It was ironic because she lived in a large, sprawling mansion, so Claudia found it always amusing that she used a tiny room when she brought friends and family for tea. "I'm just seeing a sofa," says Claudia, "and a window. It looks perfectly normal to me."
"Why, Mrs. Hancock, is there only one cushion on this sofa? What happened to the other one?"
Claudia stares at the photograph in surprise. The detective was absolutely right. "There are usually 2 cushions on that sofa. Maybe someone spilt red wine or juice on the cushion, so Elspeth sent it to the cleaners. That is a possibility, you know."
"It was missing from the living room, Mrs. Hancock. We made inquiries at your mother's local cleaners. No cushion covers were handed in by your mother-in-law for cleaning. I need to tell you, Mrs. Hancock, that on the autopsy report, green fibres, similar to the other cushion, were found in your mother-in-law's hands. Your mother-in-law had bruising around the mouth and nose. The coroner believes she was smothered to death. We believe the cushion on the sofa was used to kill her."
Claudia looked confounded. "You're joking, Detective! Is this true? But what about the pills she was supposed to have taken? I was told they were found next to her body. Did you do a toxicology test?"
"You ask very good questions, Miss Hancock. For your information, the bottle of pills was crushed. It seems the pills were placed in your mother-in-law's mouth after death, but none of those pills were found in her bloodstream by toxicology. They were found in the mouth, of course. Your mother-in-law did not die from an overdose of pills. Someone went to great lengths to stage your mother-in-law's death, to make it look like a suicide. We are treating this investigation as a murder inquiry, and as you correctly point out, your husband, his sister, and her husband, and yourself, of course, are all people of interest in this investigation. I need to establish your alibis, to find out whereabouts you were around the time that Elspeth lost her life. This is very significant, Mrs. Hancock. If we can establish you have a solid alibi, we may be able to remove your name from our suspect list. Where were you between the hours of 3 o'clock in the afternoon to 7 p.m. at night?
I was at home taking care of the children.
Can you verify your alibi, Mrs. Hancock?
Well, June Peregrine came to visit me for tea at 3:30 that afternoon. She did leave at about 6.
And what about your husband, Mrs. Hancock? Where was he?
He wasn't feeling terribly well. He came home from work early. He went to lie down on his bed, but I believe June saw him when he came back home. She can verify that.
What time did he get home, Mrs. Hancock?
It was about 3:30, I think. You can check with his officers at what time he left. His secretary would probably be able to tell you. It would take 30 minutes from his work to get back home.
Are you sure your husband never left the house at any point when he returned home? Could he have slipped out without your knowing while you were entertaining your friend June?
He could have, Detective, but I'm pretty sure he did not. I don't understand why anyone would want to harm Elspeth, and Graham adored his mother, absolutely adored her. He'd never harm a hair on her head. She was a headstrong woman, you know, but I cannot believe anyone would want to harm her.
That's what we're trying to find out, Mrs. Hancock. You do know that your sister-in-law, Simone, and her husband Oliver, were the last people to have seen her alive. They popped over to her house when she was doing some yard work. They had lemonade and cheesecake with her. But they say they left the house, and when they did, she was very much alive. How is your sister-in-law's relationship with her mother, Mrs. Hancock?
It's quite good these days, actually. But they do have issues from time to time, of course.
Issues about what, Mrs. Hancock?
Well, money, of course. I mean, it's no secret that my mother-in-law is incredibly wealthy, and my sister-in-law has been desperate to get pregnant over the years. She and Oliver, well, they aren't exactly loaded. Theo, her father, before he died, paid for her to have IVF treatments, but Elspeth put a stop to all that. She said she was not going to support her having children in a relationship that was clearly not secure.
Why is the relationship not secure between your sister-in-law Simone and her husband Oliver? Asked the detective, looking curiously interested.
Well, it's no secret, Detective. He's a prize cad. Everybody knows that. My sister-in-law knows he's an insatiable cheat. He hooks up with girls on Tinder all the time for one-night stands. And Simone finds all the evidence of his indiscretions at the back of his truck. That always smells very strongly of woman's perfume, I have to say.
So your sister-in-law is aware of her husband's infidelity? Is that what you're telling me? And she puts up with it?" asked the detective, looking more than a little befuddled. "Do they have an open marriage by any chance?"
"Absolutely not. I think that Oliver would freak out if Simone was to cheat on him. But she never ever would. She's hopelessly in love with the man. Personally, I think his face looks like that of a hippopotamus. But Simone, well, she thinks he's a demigod. And she's desperately afraid of losing him. So she puts up with all his nonsense."
"I don't know how to phrase this delicately, Mrs. Hancock, but I need to say it nevertheless. Your sister-in-law, Simone, and her husband, Oliver, do you think that they could be capable of harming your mother-in-law, Elspeth, over a financial dispute, perhaps? Before you get offended, I would like to remind you that many women can be driven to extremes if they rarely want a baby. And your mother-in-law not paying for IVF treatments for her daughter, when she could afford to do so, well, that might have been like a kick in the guts to Simone, don't you think?"
"Detective, I assure you, Simone could not harm a fly. And yes, her husband's a prize cad. But I don't think Oliver would harm Elspeth, even if she refused to financially help them out. They know what she's like. They have for years and years. I doubt they'd bother to even approach her for a loan."
"When you are short of money, Mrs. Hancock, or when you're incredibly greedy, you can be driven to great desperation. Believe you me, many of the crimes I've investigated over the years have had a great deal to do with finances."
"My sister-in-law and her husband are doing financially fine, Detective, as far as I know. I mean, he doesn't earn a fortune, Oliver, of course, but they can afford, to live well. Obviously, they can't afford the extravagance of IVF treatments, but that's a whole nother story, isn't it?"
The detective nodded. "Well, not many people can afford those fertility clinics. They rob you blind, as far as I know."
Claudia nodded. "It is ridiculous," she agreed. "Poor Simone. She'd still love to have a baby. She's not too old for one. But I do agree with my mother-in-law, Detective. Well, my late mother-in-law, that is. I don't think that bringing a child into a fractured relationship is a good idea. And if your husband is cheating on you, then your relationship is definitely fractured. I've never told Simone that, of course. She's always thought her mother to be extremely unreasonable. But Elspeth was one of the wisest people I've ever known. She believed that struggle was good for the character, And in many ways I know exactly what she means. I've seen far too many people who've had life far too easy. And those people, they lack empathy and compassion."
"I couldn't agree with you more, Mrs. Hancock. I've met such people myself. I am surprised your sister-in-law puts up with such nonsense from her husband. I think most women would be filing for divorce if they knew that their husbands were up to so much mischief."
"Detective," I said, raising a brow, "Simone is not like most women. You need to understand that. She's incredibly old-fashioned and refuses to hear a bad word said about Oliver."
"It would seem you are right about that, Mrs. Hancock, and that is what worries me considerably. If you can think of anyone, Mrs. Hancock, who would have reason to harm your mother-in-law Elspeth, I would greatly appreciate it if you would give me a call at the station. As you correctly pointed out, in your mother-in-law's will it is her children and a charity that will gain a considerable amount of money in her inheritance. How are you and your husband's finances, Mrs. Hancock? I assure you appreciate that I need to ask these very awkward and uncomfortable questions."
"But of course, Detective, I understand that I'm a suspect as I do stand to gain from Elspeth's death. And believe it or not, I'd also like to find out who killed her. She was a good woman, Detective. She didn't deserve to die. In the beginning I didn't particularly warm to her, but I soon realized that she had her heart in the right place. You asked me about my finances, Detective, when I'm quite sure you have copies of our bank statements. So you know that although we're not rich, we have savings, we pay our bills, and we're definitely not in debt, so we muddy along just fine."
You've got me, Mrs. Hancock, said the detective, flushing. You're a very shrewd woman, as I keep saying. Thank you very much for your time. And with that he handed her his card, and Claudia walked away from the station to be joined by her husband, Simone and Graham. They all stared at each other in confoundment, with only one question on their minds. Who would want to kill Elspeth Hancock? So there we are. That's the end of part 3. I look forward to you joining me tomorrow night for part 4.